to the Maryland State Senate at the age of 27, 110 years ago. Why anybody would get up to speak after Elijah Cummings spoke, Delman Coates spoke, and then my Baptist friend Ben Cardin spoke. I'm going to go to my synagogue pretty soon and speak. Well, I'm a Baptist and I'm not an associate member here. I don't know what happened, Delman. I want to echo what has been said about Pastor Coates. The civil rights movement was led by men and women of deep faith. That faith gave them courage to follow their convictions. That faith informed them of the moral rights and wrong that ought to be protected and pursued. Delman Coates, like Reverend John Lewis and Reverend Martin Luther King, and so many other members of the church, and not just the Christian faith, but the Jewish faith as well, without whom the civil rights movement could not have been pursued. Delman Coates is such a leader. He displays that every day. To that extent, he replicates the courage and conviction of the boy from Troy. All of you know who the boy from Troy is. He's in the house. And he's in this house. And he's my friend. And I've had the great privilege, Elijah said it well, for all 434 of his colleagues. We all count it a blessing and an honor to serve and be called a colleague of John Robert Lewis. The boy from Troy heard Martin Luther King on the radio. He's going to tell you about that, so I won't go into the story. But at a very young age, about 10 years younger than we were, than you are, he went to Atlanta. And he said, "Here am I, send me." And he agreed to go wherever it was needed to go. If you haven't read the letter from the Birmingham jail, you need to read it. And Martin Luther King told members of the clergy, Reverend, who said, "Don't cause trouble." He's going to talk about good trouble. Martin Luther King said, "I'm here because injustice is here." Delman Coates is in places where injustice is, he's there. John Lewis and I walked across that Edmund Pettus Bridge for at least 10 times. He's gone probably 14 or 15 times. Remembering that March 7th, 1965 day when he walked across that bridge with 600 others. I walk across the bridge with him and have no fear that there's going to be somebody on the other side of the bridge who wants to take a baton and strike me on the head, or wants to run me down with a horse, or wants to set a dog upon me. But John Lewis knew all that was waiting for him. And those 599 others knew that as well. But they were people of faith and conviction and courage. And they walked across that bridge and kept going. And we know the result. The result was John Lewis was almost killed. Others were beaten badly. And just a few days later, a reverend from out of town, a white reverend, was killed. As others were, Viola Luzio, a few days later. We walk across that bridge in remembrance that that March 7th, 1965 day had a galvanizing effect on our country. And just a few months later, Lyndon Johnson came before the Congress of the United States and said, we need to do better. And he looked the camera in the eye and said, we shall overcome. John shed a tear, as did others. King shed a tear when he heard the President of the United States repeating the galvanizing mantra of the Civil Rights Movement, demonstrating the hope that we shall overcome. That generation, John's generation, my generation, John was a leader. I was just a bag carrier. John's generation made a difference for our country. What we are here today about is that, as Elijah Cummings said, it's our time. And we need to have our uniform on. We need to have our courage and conviction displayed, knowing full well that it will not cost us time in jail. It will not cost us a concussion and near death. What it will cost us is our time and our effort and our commitment to voting. What is democracy? Democracy is the people speaking. And how in a Republican form of government do the people speak? Not as they do in Massachusetts or other places where they have a town hall meeting and everybody comes together. We're a country of 320 million people. That's not practical. And so what we do is periodically we ask people to express their opinion, to speak. And how do they speak? They speak by voting. And there are some in this country who would like to silence a lot of the voices in this country, to keep them from speaking, to keep them from voting. Very frankly, I will tell you, my friends, that if I thought that the majority of people, if they all voted, were going to vote for me, I wouldn't stop them from 1 second from voting. But if, on the other hand, I thought that if all the people voted, I might lose, my response would be, let's try to make sure they don't all vote. Yeah. But the founding fathers, who were not perfect, but whose premise was, at least for those they enfranchised, which were not women, which were not people of color, but at least for those they enfranchised, white males, that their voices should be heard. Today I had a luncheon. Some of you were there. That lunch honored Women's Equality Day. In August of 1920, almost 140 years after, actually, we started the government of the United States, but almost 130 plus years after Thomas Jefferson said that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. It was not until 1920 that we said women were created by God as well as equals, and we should treat them as such, and they ought to be able to vote. Now, of course, African Americans theoretically had the right to vote. Males. We honored Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who lived 86 years, and most of their years they were fighting for women's suffrage. And it took them a long time to get it done, and in fact, neither of them was alive when it was accomplished. But they fought the good fight. They kept the faith. No one has kept the faith better than John Lewis. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we're here because there was a case, Shelby County, who has been cited, that county's been cited over and over again for election violations. Took Eric Holder, the Attorney General, to court and said the Voting Rights Act is out of date. It passed in 2006. John Lewis and I were co-sponsors of that legislation. John spoke passionately and compellingly for its adoption. It was adopted overwhelmingly in the House and the Senate and signed by George W. Bush. It was a bipartisan piece of legislation. Jim Sensenbrenner was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, a Republican from Wisconsin. Over 10,000 pages of testimony about why the Voting Rights Act was still necessary. And the Supreme Court, by 5-4, said things are better. You know what Ruth Bader Ginsburg said? The majority in saying things are better are like the person who has an umbrella in the rain. Says, I'm not getting wet, I'll give it away. Think about that. Yeah. The rain's still coming down. We still need the Voting Rights Act. John Lewis and I and others are co-sponsors of legislation to restore the Voting Rights Act fully. John Lewis and I and Jim Sensenbrenner are co-sponsors of legislation which gets us most of the way back, which might get some Republican votes, give us a majority in the House. I think we could pass it. Unfortunately, it has not been brought to the floor. And it needs to be brought to the floor. Because if it's brought to the floor, we will pass it. We will pass it. Is that right, John? So that's what this meeting is about. We need to raise our voices. We need to tell members of Congress, not just me or John, but every member of Congress needs to hear it from your brothers and sisters, your aunts, your uncles, your moms and dads, wherever they live. Call up their member and say, you need to do this. Because that's what America is about. Democracy is about the voice of the people, expressed through voting. Thank you for being here. Thank you, John Lewis, for being here.